Well, obviously we're not in your studio.
No.
You're in between studios right now.
Yes.
And maybe we should say we're in Jay Dorney Modern Art.
Yes.
How's that?
In his office.
In his office. Okay. The thing that I think about a lot when I look at your work is I seem to have this feeling that I'm watching like thought processes. And when I look at what you do, that becomes a very apparent part to me, or a very big part to me. Do you have any? Do you think about that, or do you intend that?
Yeah, I think that's very nice to hear, because that's what my work is about, as far as I'm concerned. You know, it's not about the objects I use. It's about how the different meanings meet each other. And it's kind of an abstract and easy thing to say. It's about thought process, or how meaning develops. You know, and how to speak about that in a more particular way is difficult. I don't know exactly what to say about it, but yes, that's what I think my work is about.
Well, do you think, when we think about thought processes or something, I mean, are they like philosophical thought processes, or, are you making propositions of one sort or another?
Well, I'm exploring where meaning comes from, how my activity and how thinking in general is meaningful, which I guess you could say that's philosophic in some way. I'm kind of watching to see how it develops, where my ideas come from, having some faith that ideas come from somewhere, you know? And it's very hard to pinpoint, you know, when you get an idea. People will often ask, like, well, what made you think of that? Why did you think to do that? And it's like, well, I don't know. Where did this idea come from? Why did I think of that? You know, I'm as much, you know, it's a mystery to me too, you know? And so I think my work is about that, you know, watching how that happens, and letting myself be free enough to, you know, try to find some surprise in there.
This makes me think about the actual objects that you use and stuff. These objects, I mean, are they specific, like where they're coming from, or?
Like, do I choose them for specific reasons?
Yeah.
Sometimes yes, and sometimes no. I mean, in some ways, I think I could use any objects. You know, if you gave me a room with, you know, 10 objects in it, told me to do something, I could do something. You know, I don't spend my time looking for exactly the right object. You know, but I think that's just part of the truth. I think that what the objects are and what their connotations are and references do enter the picture. And I sometimes go looking for things because they have, you know, a specific reference. Okay.
Let's go back to meaning for a minute.
Okay.
Like, when we're talking about the thought processes and meaning, I guess it makes me think like, I mean, could you be more specific, I guess, is what I'm talking about? Like, meaning, like what kind of meaning? Like, is it linguistic meaning, or semiotic meaning, or both, or some other meaning, or?
Semiotic meaning, linguistic meaning?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
I don't start in a verbal place. You know, I sort of begin with my experience, I think. In some sort of general way, my work begins with experience of objects and places and color and size and how stuff affects me physically.
So it's a reciprocity going on between you and materials or objects.
Yeah.
And these things start to create forms.
Yes. But I'm creating those forms with those things, you know, even if it might feel like it's, you know, outside of my controls often. But to say that doesn't mean that I don't think language is a part of what's happening there. You know, I think that, or that I'm stupid. You know, I use my brain and I'm thinking, and there are ideas and concepts that carry from one work to another. But I think that I have some faith that that part of the work kind of carries along even if I'm not focused on it. You know, so I don't have to be thinking about what the work means, what the framework is all the time. You know, I at various times consciously focus on those places and work at those things. And at other times I just kind of set up a situation to experience.
Well, do you think the word ineffable is a good description of meaning?
What does that mean, ineffable?
It's kind of not being able to describe it. It's like beyond words, or?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that I work in a place that starts without words, but I don't think it's beyond words.
Is that why they ground to the wall?
Maybe, yeah.
Well, I think in a lot of your pieces you always do go back to the wall and ground it to the wall. It kind of makes me think about painting, but it also makes me think about bringing it back down to somewhere.
Well, I think attaching it to the wall is sort of, in my way of thinking, the other end of the spectrum. That it's attaching it to something immediate. And words and thinking and ideas are more abstract. They're not so time-based. You carry around this concept in your head, where plugging something into the wall is this wall here now, you know, electricity is happening now, it's an event. And that, for me, that's all in contrast to a more abstract conceptual framework that holds the work together.
So it's two different times. We're talking time and time.
Yes, or time and no time.
Kind of has me, that would go back to the word meaning.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, you know, in some ways a large part of experience or thinking is not time-based. But the experience of an object is time-based. And how those two things meet is something I always really like.
So you have this kind of like process and construction of time thinking, right?
Yeah.
That's going on with this real physical thing.
Yeah.
And then you plug it into different time. It's more of a weird abstract time.
No.
Is that what you're...
Like plug it in, that plugging it in is still part of this time process
Right.
making. The more abstract, not time-based part of it has to do with its reference to pain
Right.
and history,
Right.
Formal composition.
But it's made out of these actual...
It's made out of this actual stuff.
Right.
But what coheres any
Right.
work isn't the stuff.
Right.
It's this kind of pictorial structure that sort of overlays the stuff. And that pictorial structure is coherent, I think, because of what we carry in our heads, which has something to do with language. And that is kind of abstract. You know, it's not a physical phenomenon. It's something that we culturally invented and carry around and share, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on, you know, what part of it we're looking at. And for me, that's in contrast to plugging it in.
Where do you know when something's optical? Where do you know when something's like sculptural in space?
I don't think I worry about the divide there. So it's not something I'm paying much attention to in those terms.
Right.
I think that those categories exist, particularly that the painting category exists. That's another abstraction that we invented. You know, it's not like trees. You know, the painting category is an abstraction that's very real to us. You know? That it exists is important to me, but that my work, you know, how the work is in it or not in it isn't something I worry about. And within painting, all of the same kind of formal things exist as in sculpture. You know, weight, mass, line. So I just sort of take, I mean, I began as a painter and began interested in that kind of pictorial quality, I guess because it's so abstract, and also became frustrated at its abstraction. So try to join it to something more concrete and physical is how it becomes sculptural, and I just take the formal qualities of painting and extend them to 3 dimensions. And for me, there's no, I don't spend my time noticing exactly when that happens. It's not so significant that I'm breaking out of one framework into another. It's significant how those 2 things are meshed somehow.
Why would you be compelled, or why would you find it necessary to be compelled to bring it back down to earth?
Interesting question. Because I felt I didn't feel very trusting of abstractions all by themselves floating around unattached. And I think it's also it's a way to bring an abstraction to my experience. I can trust my experience of a moment. And if I bring an abstraction and sort of mesh it with that, it's a way to trust it in some way, I think. It also, for me, it's very interesting to explore, how those abstractions are as real as stuff. So it's also a way to validate abstraction. And when I say that, I mean that I can think of like abstract painting, abstraction in art, but also subjectivity. Subjectivity is abstract. So to bring that to meet kind of physical moments is a way out to validate that subjectivity or feeling, or kind of know that it exists, that it is as real as this physical moment.
Well, that kind of makes me think of, you've been related to Rauschenberg a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I've always had a kind of a difficult time with that relationship. With you and Rauschenberg, because there's something very different about what you do, and the time is different. And I always think of him as being very sort of like expansive and social, like he's always going out socially.
Right.
And in your work, it seems to be social, or the thought processes are social or socialized, or you're willing to be social in that way, but then you kind of bring it back in.
Mm-hmm. Back in, how do you mean?
Well, it becomes a different, then you bring it back to another place, and once I said Rosenquist to you, there's a stillness or some kind of, for all the time going on, you bring a stillness to that. And actually, I was thinking about this the other day, and I was thinking about Vermeer, of all people.
Rauschenberg, I agree that Rauschenberg's work tends to be more literary in some way than mine. That his references and images kind of accumulate and are used for their literary or narrative references. And that my work does that a lot less than his. It's more abstract in some ways. I think it's also true that I'm very concerned with having some kind of formal stasis occur in each work, kind of amidst all of this running off and chaos and disorder. There's always a place in the work where things cohere in a very formal way. And it is a very different time. Reading about Rauschenberg's early work, I think I feel a lot of affinity to the way he was thinking and working then. But I think when he was doing that, there was, people were still kind of playing with how things could be disordered and chaotic, and now that's all.
We talked about like going out the street, and that's really wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah, and now, I've grown up with that as a background, so I'm kind of, I guess, more interested in how that meets something else. I've never said that before. I'll think about it. Well, it's where it meets an order, where disorder meets order, where kind of conservative, formal abstraction or classical composition, how that meets, chaos and disorder, how a systematic way of thinking meets a more random, chance kind of structure. How those two things work together. Not that one is good and the other is bad. Both of those ways work.
It makes me think that you think in very non-hierarchical ways.
I think that's true. Yeah. At least I tried. I think it's part of my attempt. It's part of what I've developed in some way to try to abandon hierarchy to really see things.
I was just wondering if, being Canadian, being here, or your experiences from Canada have affected you or brought anything to your work or influenced it in any way?
Well, I think that being Canadian of American parents, growing up in Canada and being a dual citizen, it meant that I was always, unsure as to what that meant. Being Canadian, being American, did it matter? Was I one or the other? I think that probably has something to do with my work. Kind of a questioning of boundary or container. And growing up in Canada, I'm from the West Coast. Growing up in Vancouver is very different than growing up in Toronto. Vancouver is very different than New York. I'm sure, that the art world is much less commercial in Canada generally, and especially on the West Coast. So I didn't grow up with any expectation to, have art be something commercial. And that's probably a little different than growing up in New York. And I think also that the landscape in Vancouver has a lot to do with my work in some way. Yeah?
Is it non-hierarchical?
No, well, in Vancouver you're always looking, you can see the ocean from almost everywhere in the city. And when you look across the ocean, you always see an island in Vancouver. You never see open sea. And the particular kind of space that happens there is very interesting. The kind of flattens out. There's this huge amount of space, but there's
always something there.
There's always something there, and so that you have these various different horizon lines where the water meets the land and the land meets the sky. And there's a kind of, you feel tension in the water, kind of there's this curve, but then it flattens out and the whole thing becomes flat. So your sense of depth is always very confused. And I think my work is sort of about that kind of space, the way of looking.
Well, yeah, that makes me, going back to Rauschenberg, it makes me think I was reading about him, and he was talking about always putting, earlier in his putting those diagrams in his painting, flatten it out again. And is that what you're talking about? You start to go way out and then you come back.
Yeah, it's about that, switching back and forth, which I do in my work. And also Vancouver is geographically very specific. So you have a real sense that a place being important there, which isn't so true here. And I think that matters to me, especially since I feel so unattached nationally. That particular place has some significance, matters.
Does that make you feel like you're more like a citizen of the globe?
Well, yes and no. Yes and no. I mean, on the other hand, having traveled to Europe so much in the last few years, I really know I'm North American. I'm not European.
Another thing I would like to talk about is there seems to be a little a difference going back to that thing about social and not social or something. There's a difference between your installations and the objects that you make. I can call them objects.
Okay, fine.
Sculpture.
Maybe the best word is little event.
Okay, little event.
Yeah.
Okay.
But sculpture and object makes perfect sense.
Those seem to be more socialized, the installations. They seem like much more like you're engaging in the environment and maybe with the viewer, where the viewer interacts with it more or something.
Right. Well, I think my process is really quite similar for both kind of work in some ways. And I don't, for me, working, I don't make it, I'm not thinking, well, now I'm making something that's more involved with the viewer here, it's just about me. I mean, that's not my feeling about what I'm doing. But I think that the installation work is tied to social space in a more specific and kind of elaborate way. So, in that sense, what you're saying makes sense to me. The smaller works are also tied to the space, but it's in a more general way. They're tied to a wall or a piece of floor or an outlet. But it's not so specific. It could be any wall, and or in most kind of gallery-like walls. You know, they're sort of tied to an institution of art, which is also social. But I think in both cases, I'm kind of interested in how my subjective world is meeting those contexts. So I think in terms of my process, they're sort of equal. But I can understand is that for viewers, there would be a difference.
Another thing I think about your work is, you know, there's a lot of people who talk about beauty now. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if I see beauty in your work. I see more like a sexy, kind of flirtatious mm-hmm. thing that goes on. But I'd like to, you know, I'd like to know if you think about beauty or what you
I'd like to know what you mean by sexy flirtatious.
They just have this very kind of well, kind of goes back to like the 60s or something. They have very now attitude, kind of like pop, this kind of like linking and, you know, they're very generous and kind of happening.
Well, I think they're beautiful. But I think that beautiful, you know, things that are beautiful to me are things that have some struggle, you know, that are kind of difficult and hard to put together. And I think that some people's definition of beauty is one that kind of reinforces notions of how things should be. And that definition of beauty for me is kind of decorative or comfortable. And I like my house to be like that. I don't like my house to be full of struggle and difficulty all the time. But in my work, what's beautiful is something that's really difficult and kind of jumpy. And I think they're beautiful, but difficult.
So it's about the process, of the process of you thinking and putting things together. That becomes beautiful.
Well, they're beautiful when they're charged and luscious, funny maybe, you know.
Witty.
I mean, that's not the way I tend to think about the work. Well, you're not the first person to say that. They thought they were witty. I can see why people say that.
Well, but you might think that's a superfluous reading.
No, I think that happens because I'm interested in there being gaps, you know, and interested in how things kind of come together and then fall apart, and that can be funny. But I don't really spend my time in my studio laughing very much. You know? Not as much as people do when they look at them.
I mean, do you think about beauty? Is it something that you think about?
I think about it because people ask about it. Mm-hmm. It's not something I spend a lot of time.
Kind of a hot question.
Yeah, yeah. It's not something that that entered my way of thinking until people ask about it. The whole question of beauty is historical, and that's, you know, I don't find that can be dismissed or uninteresting. But the question of beauty used to be one of looking for beauty as an absolute, and I don't think that's true. You know, I don't think anything is absolute in that way. And what do you mean by beauty, better I think about it?
Go back to the word experiential. Since this kind of brings it up again to me. How would you describe experiential? Because I mean, since you say this about there's not really a story, and it's kind of in a reciprocity with you and the things, and It is experiential. How would you describe that to somebody, like, other than in those terms?
I hope I didn't offend you about trying to ask about hobbies.
No, you didn't offend me at all. So your questions are really good.
I was trying to think, what's the hobby question?
Yeah.
No, it was good. It was good.
I didn't know if you had like little things or something. Or...
Yeah, no, it was fine.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well,
like-
noticing the moment, noticing myself, noticing, noticing the time it takes me to move from here to there, how long it might take my eyes to move, noticing what that color feels like, how it feels next to another color, noticing how my mind moves from a thought